You recently received this handout that kind of helps you understand how to use and source the documents in the DBQ essay. I wanted to go over this with you a little bit in this video, showing you how really easy this is if you read and comprehend the documents and you have a strong thesis and you know what you want to say, then actually incorporating the documents in and sourcing them properly isn't that difficult to do. First of all, I want to remind you that the documents are essentially your evidence for this essay. Now, you are required to include at least one, and ideally two, pieces of outside evidence that doesn't come from the documents, but nonetheless supports your thesis. But for the most part, these 7 documents are going to be your specific historical evidence, and you want to use them much the way you would use evidence in an LEQ. When you are using a document in the essay, there's really 3 key things you want to do. And honestly, you can do all this in 3 sentences, most likely in this order. So first and foremost, you want to briefly describe what the document is telling you. Now, keep it brief because the reader is familiar with the document. They know these documents inside and out. So you don't need to really describe the document to them. You really don't want to write this, and you don't even want to be thinking this. You don't want to write anything like, here's what document 1 says. They know what it says. What you want to do is just describe the main idea from the document that you're going to use to support your claim. So the documents might include, several key points or ideas, but what is it that you're taking away from this document that is going to support the claim you're making? That's what we mean by describe what the document says. Okay. Also, I don't have it on this handout, but do not quote the documents. I always say if you quote like a short phrase, just a few words, because it's just so important to what the document is saying, all right, that's acceptable, but that should really only happen maybe once in the entire essay. You don't want to get in the habit of quoting because, first of all, it's a waste of time. The reader has the documents. They know what they say. But usually that's a clue to the reader that you don't know what they say. You're quoting them hoping that, the main idea is somehow in there. Don't do that. Just tell us what it is, what this document's saying or doing that is relevant to your claim, your thesis. All right. Then you want to make sure that you're analyzing the document. You're showing how or why it's supporting your thesis. Now, I have in parentheses there, contextualization or complex understanding. It's possible that you're using a document in one of those parts of your essay, particularly in the complex understanding. Contextualization, almost, I don't want to make that a rule, but you really shouldn't have the documents in your contextualization because remember, contextualization is something that happened before or something that follows or something kind of seemingly unrelated to the essay, but nonetheless is important to understand it. So if you're using the documents in contextualization, you're probably not contextualizing. You're probably just addressing the prompt as it is. But in your complex understanding, you almost certainly could be using some of the documents. Maybe that document or two that seems to go against your main idea. So you're pointing out how it's nonetheless relevant. But having said that, after or maybe before you've described the key idea in the document, you want to show how it's supporting your thesis. And this is where you should also be using that historical thinking skill. So if it's a causation essay, you're showing cause and effect relationships or comparison. You're showing how it's similar or different. This, of course, is a continuity and change essay. So maybe you're showing how it demonstrates a change in Americans' ideas about independence. That should be clear in your analysis. And then finally, and these don't necessarily have to go in this order, describe, analyze, and then source the document. They could go in almost any order. It all depends on your writing style and how you want to do it. But I'm going to say last thing you should do is then source the document using one of the 4 methods, the CAP acronym. Just remember that you're not just identifying the context. You're not just identifying the audience or the purpose or the point of view. You're showing why that matters. Why knowing who this person is, who wrote this, or this group is that said this, why that is relevant to history, why that's relevant to your thesis or claim. So I'm going to show you some examples here in a minute, but that is key. You don't just get the point because you identified the context, audience, purpose, point of view. You earn it because you show why that's relevant to the document, why that's relevant to your claim. And then as that next bullet point says, usually you could do all of this in probably 3 or 4 sentences. If they're short sentences, maybe a few more, maybe 3, 4, 5. If they're a little more complex sentences, probably 3. Okay. Also, another little key point, do not refer to the documents by their number. Document 1 says, it's bad writing, and it often signals to the reader that this is a bad essay. I don't want to say that's always the case, but it is. It really is. You would not refer to historical evidence that way. You would not say, my historical evidence number 1 says, you would talk about it as if you know what you're talking about. Same thing with the documents. If this is the Gettysburg Address, like I have there, talk about it as if you know what the Gettysburg Address says, and you know what Lincoln's purpose was, and who his audience was, and what Lincoln's point of view was. Talk about the documents as if they're real historical documents with real historical evidence, because they are. Okay, the rest of this handout that I gave you kind of gives you some tips and reminders about the 4 ways of sourcing. The last bullet point kind of gives you some structure or framework for how to maybe talk about them. I think it's sometimes helpful to use subtle references to what method you're using. In that first one, the historical context for this document is, or this document's best understood in the context of, showing the reader that word context kind of says, hey, don't miss this. But at the same time, you don't want to be too blunt. You don't want to be like, I'm going to source the document with context now. Here it goes. Try to be subtle. My examples might show you that. And I think every time I put this document or the author in parentheses to indicate you wouldn't actually say this document or the author. You would use its name or the author's name. But obviously I wanted this to be generic. All right, that handout you have. This handout will be uploaded into Canvas in the writing module under DBQs. It's some examples of how to properly use and source some of the documents in this particular practice DBQ. So I don't expect you to copy this exactly. I don't want to see my own writing in your first attempt at this essay, but I thought you needed to see real examples with the DBQ you're working with. So that's what these are. Now, what I did here was I color-coded each of them so you can kind of see what I'm doing in each sentence. So the red part is kind of, the thesis or the claim that's being made. It's a little bit of the analysis. It's not the document. It's just setting up, how I'm using the document. So it is closer to maybe the analysis part, because it's building on whatever my thesis would have been for this essay. I'm not writing the whole essay here. I'm just, trying to come up with examples of how to use the document, but you need that somewhere. The green part is the actual description of the document. It's just, here's what it says. Here's the main idea that I'm pulling out. And then finally, the blue part is the sourcing. And although each of them is labeled above, you should be able to pull out those little clues that show how it's being sourced. Also, as we read these, look for, why this matters, why this is important. Because again, you don't earn the point just for identifying the context. You have to kind of show how it relates. Okay, so let's look at number one. This is using context with the document. So my argument is that by the 1770s, many in America were starting to advocate for greater protection of their natural rights, and were beginning to challenge British authority in different ways. In 1772, Sam Adams wrote about the rights of the colonists, arguing that all men have a right to leave the society they belong to and enter into another. Adams' argument is best understood in context of the growing influence of Enlightenment ideas in America, as he argues for natural rights and some of the ideas of the social contract. So there, my context is, well, this is in the midst of the Enlightenment, and these ideas are gaining traction in America. And so when you read Adams' Rights of the Colonists, you pick up those Enlightenment ideas in there. And that's why he's, saying these things, okay? That's why it matters. All right, so that's one example. Audience, I might have said this before, but sometimes I find audience the hardest to use. Remember, you have to do this 3 times successfully. Of the 7 documents, you must use 6, but we're going to try to use all 7. And you must source at least 3. But since we need to do all 3 well, we should probably try it with 4 or 5 or 6 if we can. But you don't have to use each of the 4 methods. You could technically use the same method every time. Although I don't pre-decide. Each document kind of lends itself to a certain type of sourcing, and that should kind of be obvious to you. Having said that, I do find audience the hardest to use. Sometimes it's not clear who that audience is, but more importantly, I think it's harder to explain why that matters. So I struggled, and I was looking at the documents, and there were only a couple that I thought audience might work here. So I tried it with the second document. So here's my kind of thesis or claim and analysis. By the late 1760s, a debate was growing in America regarding the legality of British tax policies. The Virginia House of Burgesses passed a series of resolves arguing that the sole power to tax the people of Virginia rested with them, the colonial legislature, and not with Parliament. The House of Burgesses likely intended these resolves to be read and discussed by other colonial assemblies in an effort to unify American opinion on this issue and to speak with one voice in opposition to Parliament's taxation. All right, notice I did not use the word audience. I didn't say the Burgesses were, audience for this was. But by saying, they likely intended it to be read and discussed by, that's pretty clear to the reader that hey, this is the audience they were thinking about. And why does that matter that they were writing presumably to the other assemblies? Because they were trying to unify thought on this. They were trying to say, look, we're British subjects. We know the British Constitution. Taxation should only be done by those that you elect, that represent you. And the people of Virginia are represented by the Burgesses, and the people of Delaware are represented by the Delaware Assembly. So they're trying to unify that position within the colonies. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. But like I said, audience can be tough. And a lot of times I find that audience and purpose overlap. So I think I did both audience and purpose with that one. So I'd like to think I'd get the point either way. Okay, point of view. This one often is an easy one to use if you know the author and you know them well. So hopefully we know Sam Adams. And I used him already. I used this document already for context, but now you'll see how I'm sourcing it differently. So I kind of copied and pasted here. By the 1770s, advocating for greater natural rights, blah, blah, blah. In 1772, Adams writes about the rights of colonists. But now, who's Sam Adams? Adams, a leader of the Sons of Liberty, represented the view of the most revolutionary Americans that had long been fighting against British tax policies. So to understand why Samuel Adams is saying this in 1772, it is helpful to know that he has been part of this movement that's been around since like the Stamp Act in 1765, called the Sons of Liberty, that had been kind of like in some of the more radical ways, railing against British policy and subtly hinting at independence, which is, if you read that document well, that's kind of what Adams is alluding to, that, we have a right to govern ourselves, and without using the words, we should declare independence. It's pretty clear that that's where he's heading. Okay, so that's point of view. And then finally, purpose. With this one, I use the document from the Quakers. So by 1775, which is a critical year, that's when Lexington and Concord, the first battles break out. We're at war. We're getting a lot closer to that Declaration of Independence. Things are heating up. By 1775, many in America were frustrated with British policies, and war, maybe even a Declaration of Independence, seemed almost inevitable. However, not all shared that view. So right here, this could be part of a complex understanding. I'm arguing that by 1775, we're heading towards war and independence. But now I'm pointing out that not everybody shares that view. Now, I'd have to do more than just maybe use this one document. Maybe here I bring in outside evidence, talk about loyalists and others who do not want to head down this road. So this could be my complex understanding. But anyway, back to how you use purpose as a way of sourcing. So in green, I described the document. Quaker leaders told the Pennsylvania Assembly that they regret the tensions that have developed between Parliament and the colonies, and that they remain loyal to the king. What's their purpose? Well, in this address, the Quaker leaders may have been trying to use their influence in Pennsylvania. Remember, Pennsylvania was started as a refuge for Quakers, and there's a lot of Quakerism in Pennsylvania, and they do have a lot of influence. Ben Franklin, for example, not a Quaker, but bad example. He wasn't a Quaker, so forget him. But other Pennsylvanians were. The Penns, that's what I'm thinking of. Anyway, in this address, the Quaker leaders may have been trying to use their influence in Pennsylvania to dissuade the legislature from supporting independence and or war. So again, why are they saying this? Why are they giving this address to the legislature? Well, they're trying to stop the Pennsylvania legislature from going down this road to independence and war. Like I said, it looks like it's going to be inevitable. Can they stop at least their colony from taking this fateful step? That's their purpose in giving this speech, okay? And again, you could see where maybe the audience is relevant, that they're speaking to the legislature. Audience is relevant. So I often think audience and purpose overlap. So if you're using one or the other, probably talk about both and you'll be fine. All right, I hope this was helpful, and it gives you some good examples of how to do this. Like I said, it's not that hard, especially if you spend some time with the documents and you know what you want to say. So good luck with all of this.